Hi, so like you said, I'm Julianne Atwater, and the title of my presentation is Margaret Roper, the Woman Behind the Man for All Seasons. It was originally titled The Importance of Margaret Roper to the Legacy of her father, Sir Thomas More, so that's what appears in your program. So as Sir Thomas More was sitting in his cell in the Tower of London, awaiting his upcoming execution, his favorite daughter Meg recited the following fable. Two men happened upon the land of apes. One of the apes had made himself king, and he was curious what these two travelers thought of him. So he asked them, "Who do you think I am?" Now the first traveler was a flatterer, so he answered, "Thou art emperor and king, the fairest creature that is on earth." And so the king liked this answer, and he bestowed many gifts upon the man. Now the king turned to the second traveler and asked him the same question, "Who do you think I am?" Now the second traveler was an honest man. And he answered, "Thou art an ape and a beast abominable." So this response angered the king, and the king ordered all the other apes to use their teeth and their claws to tear apart the second traveler. Now this is one of Aesop's fables that More used to read to his children when they were younger. Ironically, More was living proof of the fable's dark moral that oftentimes honest men lose their lives. And More, like the second traveler, was killed for his moral conviction. More never left his cell again until the day of his execution. However, thanks to the intellect and devotion of his favorite daughter, Meg, More's beloved writings and legacy still live on today. So Sir Thomas More was born in England in 1478, and he was publicly beheaded by King Henry VIII in 1535. He was declared a saint by Pope Pius XI 400 years later, and then in 2000, Pope John Paul II named him the heavenly patron of statesmen and politicians. So More was a successful lawyer, a beloved under-sheriff, which is like a chief deputy, and a very respected politician. He became King Henry VIII's right-hand man, and he also published the classic work Utopia in 1516. So in 1520, Robert Whittington named him a man for all seasons because of his many talents and his unmatched morality and integrity. And there have been multiple plays and movies about Sir Thomas More by that same title, A Man for All Seasons. And I went over this story already. And so More was loved by the people of England. He became Speaker of the House of Commons. He was King Henry VIII's top advisor, and ultimately he was one of the most important men in all of England. But despite his remarkable life, he is now mainly remembered for his death. He opposed King Henry VIII's annulled marriage and subsequent denial of papal authority. This is when Henry started the Anglican Church and thus denied the authority of the Pope. And More was a devout Catholic, and so he refused to do this. And so More was publicly beheaded in 1535. So Margaret Roper, or as she's referred to in her father's writings as Meg, she spent most of her life trying to collect and publish her father's work. And so without her, much of his beloved writings wouldn't exist. So at this time, most girls received very little education. But More was a huge proponent of education, and he wanted his daughters to also be learning along with his son. So from a very young age, he made sure they were actively learning. And Meg showed signs of her superior intellect from a very young age. When she was only 3 years old, she began reading. And she also shared her father's same hunger for learning. And so though he loved all of his children and tried to treat them all the same, his writings make it pretty clear that Meg was his favorite child. So in 1509, when Meg was just 4 years old, More was named honorary lawyer for the prestigious Mercer's company. So he was gone all the time. He was a pretty absent father, and he mostly kept in touch with his children through letters. He also used letters to stay in touch with his good friend Erasmus, who lived in Holland. Erasmus was a famed scholar, theologian, and author of works such as In Praise of Folly. And he and More were intellectual soulmates, if you will. They were best friends, and they challenged each other to become smarter and better men. They corresponded mostly through letters, which Erasmus called a mutual conversation between absent friends. So through these letters, they engaged in literary competitions and intellectual debates. Moore's wife and Meg's mother, Jane Colt Moore, died in 1511 from an unknown illness. Now, Erasmus said that Moore married Jane because she was untrained and Moore could mold her into whatever he liked. And so she was a very submissive wife, and she never argued with her husband. Just 1 month after Jane's death, Moore was remarried to a woman named Alice Middleton. And Alice was resourceful and opinionated, and according to Erasmus, she was loud, bossy, and ignorant. According to another family friend, Ammonia, she was aged, blunt, and rude. But Ammonia added that Moore full entirely loved her. So Moore's relationship with Alice was very different from his relationship with Jane. While Jane was very passive, Alice loved to argue and would argue any chance she got. And she also shared Moore's quick wit and his love of humor. In 1518, Moore accepted King Henry VIII's offer to become a royal counselor. So from here on out, he was absent even more. He still wanted his children to receive a top-notch education, though, so he hired only the finest tutors. His 5 tutors included a physician to the king, a royal astronomer, an emissary for the Pope, and 2 Oxford professors. So his children received a pretty good education. Now, at this time, it was pretty unheard of for women to seriously pursue education. They were denied access to all universities in England until many years later. But Moore believed that women were just as capable of learning as men were. So he made sure that his daughters were just as well educated as his son. And he was heavily influenced by the writing of Plato. So here in Book 5 of Plato's Republic, this is just an excerpt. I won't read the whole thing. But basically, Plato is arguing that women are just as capable of men, and so they should therefore receive the same education. So the Moore children studied logic, philosophy, theology, math, astronomy, Greek, and Latin. At the time, very few women in Europe learned Latin, never mind young girls, so it was really cool that Moore had his young daughters learning it. However, only his son, John, was taught rhetoric, because Moore believed it was immoral for women to speak eloquently in public. So he probably wouldn't approve of the female presenters today. Moore encouraged his children to write daily letters. In one letter, he wrote to them, "I cannot express to my dearest children the deep pleasure your eloquent letters gave me. I assure you that I have no greater solace in all the vexatious business in which I am immersed than to read your letters." And that's very similar to the text that my dad sends me. So Meg acted as a family messenger, so she would relay information back and forth from her father to her siblings. And her father was especially curious about their studies. He wanted to know what they were learning, what they were reading, and he especially enjoyed Meg's writing. He saw potential in her that rivaled his own. And so sometimes he would accidentally show her writings to some of his friends because he didn't want it to seem like he was bragging. So one time he mistakenly handed her letter to a very well-educated man, the Bishop of Exeter. And the bishop was very impressed by this writing, and he was even more impressed when he found out it was actually written by a woman. Similarly, Erasmus, who saw little need for women to be educated anyways, was also impressed with Margaret's writing, and he said it contained nothing whatever silly or girlish. And from Erasmus, not girlish was a pretty big compliment. And so Moore once challenged Meg to a competition, and when they finished, he remarked that her draft was written with such great skill that one would not know which to prefer, his or hers. And one of her tutors, William Canal, suggested that she publish her work. But Moore reprimanded him for the mere thought of this, because though men often gave in to the vain temptation to share their works with others, he thought that Meg should be satisfied with the praise of her father and her husband. So unfortunately, most of her writings are now lost. It's ironic that though Meg spent most of her life devoted to making sure his works were preserved, he wanted to make sure that her works remained unknown. So as Meg grew older and Moore grew busier with his career, Meg took over as Erasmus's main pen pal. She even found a couple mistakes in one of his translations, and Erasmus called her one of the leading female intellectuals in all of Europe. And now she got married at age 16, and so now her father no longer could tell her not to publish her work. And her husband, William Roper, didn't really care what she did. So she anonymously published a book, which was actually a translation of Erasmus's work. And this book ultimately was banned by the Catholic Church. And so although it was anonymous, it said that the author was a gentlewoman of 19 years of age, but they kind of knew that it was Meg that wrote it, so they called her into court and they had her kind of defend herself, and she ended up impressing everyone in attendance by what she had to say. All right, so this is where the trouble starts. King Henry VIII. As I talked about earlier, Sir Thomas More was King Henry VIII's most trusted advisor, and they were really, really close. And yet, King Henry VIII then had More publicly beheaded. So why did that happen? So this is just a quick background. King Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, and when she couldn't produce a son for him, he got rid of her and wanted to bring in Anne Boleyn. He asked the Pope to grant an annulment, but the Pope refused this. So King Henry broke off from the Catholic Church, denied papal authority, and started the Anglican Church. He required all members of government to swear allegiance to him and his new wife, Anne. But More was a devout Catholic. He was actually known for his persecution of Protestants such as Martin Luther. And while he was in charge, at least 6 Protestant reformers were burned at the stake under his charge, basically. And so he refused to deny papal authority. So More said he would still acknowledge Queen Anne as the queen, but yet he set up a boycott of her coronation. So obviously she was very upset about this, and so she all but asked for his head on a silver platter a la John the Baptist. In 1534, More was brought before Parliament to take the oath of loyalty to the new act of succession. However, he refused to do this because he was still in support of the Pope. So he was not denying the royal authority of King Henry and Queen Anne, but their religious authority. But nonetheless, he was still convicted of treason in a very biased trial that lasted only 15 minutes. He was sentenced to death, and first he was brought into the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned. So this painting depicts Meg pleading on her father's behalf as he's taken away to the Tower. So at first, no visitors were allowed in More's cell. So Meg mostly corresponded with him through letters, just as she had done when she was younger. Eventually, though, she was allowed to visit him, and she became his most trusted companion. And by most accounts, she was the only person that was allowed to visit him while he was imprisoned. Now, More allowed her to visit him because he received a very troubling letter from Meg, in which he said was worse than the pain of death. And so basically in this letter, she tries to get her father to just take the oath and just save his life. Like, it's not worth dying for. And this letter broke More's heart, because here his beloved daughter wasn't made of the same moral strength that he was, and she didn't understand that this was a cause worth dying for. But most scholars speculate that Meg's letter was just a trick to get her into Thomas More's cell. So in her letter, she pretended to believe that the cause wasn't worth dying for. But once she was actually in the cell, she told her father, "Don't worry, I'm completely on board with you, and I'm going to help you state your case." Before Thomas More was able to read her letters, the king's men, like the guards, would read through it and see what she was writing. So they saw that she was trying to convince him to take the oath, and so they were like, all right, we need to let her talk to him more so that she can convince him to take the oath, and then this can be used as propaganda to bolster King Henry's campaign against these heretics. So basically, the king's men wanted Meg to visit her father as often as possible. So essentially, she tricked them into letting her into his cell. So while he was in prison, Meg was More's rock. They recited Bible passages and fables, they talked about theology and philosophy, and they held storytelling competitions with each other. And their conversations were the basis for a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, which More wrote while he was in the Tower. Now, this was a fictional work that offered support to victims of religious persecution. One of the characters was based on More, and the other character was based on Meg. So at the time, he was just in his cell and he had very limited writing supplies. So he actually wrote this down on stone tablets. And then Meg took those out of the cell with her, she smuggled them out, and then she later copied them down. they also teamed up to write a letter to a friend that was supposedly from Meg, describing her attempts to convince her father to take the oath. But in reality, this letter was just an excuse for Moore to write down his reasons that he thought this was a cause worth dying for. So as one scholar says, they put together an inflammatory political testament brilliantly camouflaged as an innocuous family letter. Moore's final work was titled, no, this is the Latin title, so excuse me if I botch this, but De Tristitia Christi, which is translated into The Sadness of Christ. So this was his final work, and it was a commentary on both Christ's suffering and on Moore's own suffering. And so although Moore was willing to die for his faith, he wasn't looking to become a martyr. And so this work really expresses his extreme fear in the final moments leading up to his death. And at this time, Meg wasn't allowed to see her father, but she still arranged to have this manuscript smuggled out of his cell. There are different accounts of how Meg acted on the day of her father's death. Some accounts describe her as running through the streets, holding on to him and hugging him and kissing him. Other accounts say she wasn't even there. So that's really up for debate. But this is a picture of the day of Moore's execution. He wasn't the only one executed that day. And right before his death, he's quoted as saying that he was the king's good servant, but God's first. After his death, his body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London. And as was customary for those convicted of treason, his head was displayed on a pike over London Bridge for a month after his death. It was also customary for the heads then to be thrown into the River Thames, but Meg was able to rescue it before that happened. So after his death, Meg devoted her time to collecting, organizing, and publishing her father's writings. She begged the council to give back Moore's letters, which they did, and she even hired someone to track down his lost letters. So Thomas Cromwell questioned her about her intent to publish her writings, but he didn't punish her because she was a woman. Unfortunately, Meg died before the collection was published, but her daughter Mary took over the job. Also, Mary translated De Tristitia Christi from Latin into English, and that was included in the final collection. The final collection was published in 1557, which was over 20 years after it was first started, and it was titled The Works of Sir Thomas More, Knight, sometime Lord Chancellor of England, written by him in the English tongue. So in conclusion, Moore provided his daughters with an unparalleled education and made sure that they were taught just as well as his son. Meg was his favorite because she took after him with her superior intellect, morality, and integrity. Without Meg's wisdom and companionship in the Tower, Moore's final days might not have produced those commentaries on death and the suffering of Christ. And without her efforts to collect and produce his writings, much of Sir Thomas More's work would have faded into oblivion. So in the end, Sir Thomas More's dedication to educating his daughters paid off, as Meg both inspired and preserved some of his most beloved works. Without Meg's help, the man for all seasons would not have the literary and religious significance that he has today. Thank you, that's the end.